Under the unforgiving glare of the school hallway's fluorescent lights, a pair of scissors caught the gleam, flashing like a cold, merciless blade. The air buzzed with the hushed, slicing whispers of students pressed shoulder to shoulder, their eyes darting between curiosity and dread. At the center of this suffocating circle stood a uniformed officer, his face carved from stone, unyielding, emotionless, a statue of authority untouched by compassion. Before him, a girl sat rigid in a chair, her body locked in place as if invisible chains bound her to the seat. Tears carved glistening paths down her cheeks, her wide eyes reflecting a storm of fear, shame, and defiance. The officer's thick fingers seized a handful of her coiled, dark hair, yanking it taut with a cruel deliberateness that made her flinch. "Maybe now you'll learn some respect," he snarled, his voice a venomous lash that ricocheted off the metal lockers, sharp enough to cut deeper than the scissors ever could. "You think you're above everyone else because of that little speech you gave in class? Let's see how proud you feel now." Her trembling hands clutched the armrests, knuckles whitening as she fought to hold herself together. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking like fragile glass. "This isn't right. You can't—" But before she could finish, his meaty palm shoved her back down, pinning her with a force that stole her breath. The scissors snapped shut with a sickening snick, and a cascade of her hair tumbled to the linoleum floor, soft and light as fallen feathers. The crowd sucked in a collective gasp, a wave of shock rippling through them, yet their feet remained rooted, their courage swallowed by the weight of the moment. No one dared meet her gaze now, her head bowed, her spirit fraying under the officer's sneer. "No more attitude," he taunted, his lips curling with satisfaction. "No more thinking you can talk back. Maybe now you'll finally know your place." The humiliation seared her, a fire hotter than the tears scalding her face. Her chest tightened, each shallow breath a struggle as she drowned in the tide of her own powerlessness. Around her, students hid cruel giggles behind their hands, while others stared, their wide eyes brimming with horror and helplessness. Somewhere in the throng, a teacher's voice rose, timid but insistent, cutting through the tension like a dull blade. "Officer, this isn't necessary. She's just a kid." The woman stepped forward, her sensible shoes scuffing the floor, her brow creased with worry. She was no stranger to the school's dramas, but this was a violation she couldn't stomach. The officer whipped around, his broad frame towering over her, his voice exploding like thunder. "She broke the rules! This school's been too soft on her kind of behavior for too long. I'm doing what's needed, teaching her a lesson she won't forget." The scissors snapped again, another chunk of hair drifting down, and the girl's heart screamed in silence. She wanted to bolt, to claw her way free, to shout until her lungs gave out, but her legs felt welded to the chair, her body betraying her will. All she could do was endure as the officer's cruelty unfolded, each second a fresh wound. Then, like a crack of lightning splitting the storm, the front doors of the school burst open. The heavy thud of boots echoed through the corridor, deliberate and unrelenting, growing louder with every step. Heads swiveled, eyes widening as a man strode into view. His dark suit clung to his frame with quiet authority, a glinting badge pinned to his chest catching the sterile light. The officer froze mid-cut, the scissors hovering as his gaze locked with the newcomers. "What are you doing here?" he barked, his bravado faltering for the first time. "This is a school matter." The man's voice sliced through the air, sharp and unyielding. "No, this is a federal matter now." Silence crashed over the room, thick and heavy, pressing down on every soul present. The officer took a shaky step back, the scissors quivering in his grip as if they'd suddenly grown too heavy to hold. "Step away from her," the man commanded, his tone low, lethal, a predator's growl wrapped in calm. "Now!" For a heartbeat, the officer hesitated, his pride wrestling with the undeniable power radiating from the man. Then, with a metallic clatter that rang like a death knell, the scissors slipped from his hand and hit the floor. The girl lifted her head, her tear-streaked face a battlefield of disbelief and fragile relief. Yet the shame lingered, a bitter taste in her mouth as she glanced at the scattered pieces of her hair, her identity, her pride, strewn like debris at her feet. "You don't understand," the officer stammered, his once-iron confidence unraveling thread by thread. "She was out of line, disrespectful. I had to—" "You had to nothing," the man snapped, cutting him off with surgical precision. "You abused your power, and now you'll face the consequences." The crowd, once paralyzed, began to stir. Phones emerged from pockets, their tiny screens glowing as students recorded every damning second. The officer's face drained of color, his authority slipping away like sand through his fingers. Then, from the edge of the chaos, a figure pushed forward. Her father, his eyes blazing with a fury so controlled it was almost serene. He locked his gaze on the officer, the man who had dared to strip his daughter of her dignity. "You picked the wrong person to mess with," he said, his voice trembling not with fear but with a righteous wrath that promised reckoning. "You think you're untouchable? You're about to learn how wrong you are." The officer's mouth gaped, words failing him as he stumbled back, his bravado crumbling under the weight of his own actions. The man in the suit pulled out his phone, his movements swift and precise, dialing a number with the ease of someone who'd done this 100 times before. Within moments, the hallway filled with the sound of more boots. Agents in dark jackets, their presence an unyielding wall of justice closing in. The students watched, jaws slack, as the officer who had wielded his power like a tyrant was now cuffed, his wrists bound by the very system he'd thought to manipulate. Whispers swelled into a chorus, some students turning away, unable to witness his fall, others staring with a mix of grim satisfaction and stunned disbelief. But the girl's eyes weren't on him. They were on her father, her rock, her shield, the man who had stormed into her nightmare and pulled her back from the abyss. Her heart still thundered with fear, but beneath it, something new flickered, a spark of hope, fragile but growing, fueled by the knowledge that she wasn't alone. As the officer was dragged away, his face flushed with humiliation, his voice rising in feeble protests, a question hung heavy in the air. How far would her father go to ensure justice wasn't just served but carved into the world as a warning? And what fate awaited the officer now that the tables had turned so decisively? The lesson was clear, etched into the silence that followed. Power, when wielded without restraint, invites its own downfall. Justice, though sometimes slow, is a force that bends toward those who stand for what's right, and its consequences are a mirror held up to the corrupt, reflecting their ruin for all to see. Earlier that day, the morning sun had spilled through the slatted blinds of the Brooks' modest kitchen, casting golden stripes across the worn wooden table. The soft clink of plates mingled with the sizzle of scrambled eggs in a pan, the scent of buttered toast curling through the air like a warm embrace. Ava Brooks sat hunched over her notebook, her elbows digging into the table's smooth surface as her pen tapped a nervous rhythm against the lined pages. Her dark eyes skimmed the words she'd written, but her mind was elsewhere, rehearsing, refining, picturing the sea of faces she'd face that afternoon. Today was no ordinary day. She was set to deliver a speech to the entire school, a moment she'd been building toward for weeks. Her topic, racial identity and systemic injustice, wasn't just a presentation. It was a piece of her soul, a cry for understanding in a world that too often turned its back. At the stove stood her father, Malcolm Brooks, his sharp gaze flicking between the morning news on his tablet and the eggs he stirred with an absent-minded hand. He was no typical dad. As the assistant director of the FBI, Malcolm had honed his life into a blade of discipline and instinct, a man who'd seen the darkest corners of human nature and emerged with an unshakable commitment to justice. At home, though, he tried to sand down those edges for Ava, the daughter who'd inherited his fire, his intellect, and his refusal to bow. "You're too quiet this morning," he said, his voice low but warm, not lifting his eyes from the screen. "That's not like you." Ava glanced up, forcing a smile that flickered and faded. Just nervous, I guess. The whole school's going to be there. What if I mess up? He set the spatula down and turned to her, his stern features softening. You won't. You've gone over this 100 times. Besides, no one out there knows more about this than you. Own it, Ava. She nodded, trying to drink in his certainty, but her stomach still churned with doubt. Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. A text from her best friend Maya flashed across the screen. Good luck today. Don't let them scare you. Ava's lips twitched with a faint grin. Maya always knew how to lift her, but the encouragement couldn't erase the unease. She'd felt the undercurrent at school, the sidelong glances from teachers, the murmured judgments in the halls, and the looming shadow of Officer Derek Grant. He'd arrived a few months ago, a towering figure with broad shoulders and an aura of command that demanded obedience. But it wasn't his presence that unsettled her. It was his eyes, cold and calculating, always lingering on the students who didn't fit his narrow mold. Ava had felt his gaze on her more than once, a silent warning she couldn't ignore. Today, as she prepared to bear her truth to the world, she knew the stakes were higher than ever. And in the pit of her stomach, she couldn't shake the feeling that justice, whether it came as a whisper or a roar, was about to demand its due. The tension between Ava and Officer Grant had been simmering for weeks, a slow burn that flared every time she dared to question him. He despised the way she wouldn't just sit quietly and accept things. Her sharp inquiries, her refusal to back down, gnawed at him. It had started months ago during a heated class discussion about law enforcement practices. Ava had challenged his smug assertions with facts and a quiet fire in her voice, and he'd snapped a warning at her then, his tone dripping with disdain. "Watch your attitude, young lady." But that moment only fueled the growing friction between them, a rift that now felt like a canyon. As Ava sat in the passenger seat of her father Malcolm's car, pulling into the overcrowded school parking lot on that crisp March morning, she couldn't shake the dread curling in her stomach. Today was her presentation, and she knew, deep down in the marrow of her bones, that it wouldn't end quietly. The lot was a chaotic sprawl of cars, glinting under the pale sunlight, and clusters of students milled about. Some clutched handmade signs and banners, their bold letters proclaiming support for Ava's speech on identity and justice. Others lingered on the edges, faces guarded, eyes narrowed with suspicion or indifference. Malcolm eased the car into a tight space, the engine's hum fading as he turned to her. His voice was steady, firm, leaving no room for debate. "Call me if anything happens." It wasn't a request. It was a command born from years of instinct and care. Ava forced a smile, her lips trembling slightly as she replied, "I'll be fine." But the words felt hollow, a fragile shield against the storm she sensed brewing. She stepped out, her sneakers crunching against the gravel, and as she approached the school's heavy front doors, her heartbeat thundered in her ears, a relentless drum roll. Inside, the auditorium buzzed with restless energy. Rows of chairs stretched out before her, packed with students shifting in their seats, teachers whispering among themselves, and even a handful of parents who'd shown up, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Ava's eyes darted to the front row where her best friend Maya sat, flashing a quick thumbs up. The small gesture was a lifeline, and Ava clung to it, trying to ignore the invisible weight pressing against her ribs. The principal, a wiry man with a perpetually pinched face, stepped to the microphone first. His introduction was brief, clipped, as if he couldn't wait to be rid of the spotlight. He waved a hand toward Ava, and she moved forward, her fingers gripping the podium's edges until her knuckles whitened. Sweat coated her palms as the microphone let out a faint, electric hum. "Good morning," she began, her voice cutting through the room with a steadiness that surprised even her, despite the panic fluttering like a trapped bird in her chest. "Today, I want to talk about identity, how it shapes us, how it defines us, and how it's often tested in ways we never see coming." She scanned the crowd, catching fleeting nods from some, while others crossed their arms, their faces hardening. She pressed on, her words gathering momentum. "But identity isn't just personal, it's political, it's historical, and sometimes it's turned into a weapon against us." The room stirred, a low murmur rippling through the audience like a gathering wind. Ava didn't falter. She wove together stories from her own life, statistics etched into her memory, and examples of racial injustice that painted a stark, unyielding picture. By the time she finished, the auditorium crackled with energy. Some students clapped, their applause sharp and defiant. Others sat rigid, lips pressed into thin lines, eyes cold. Then Officer Grant rose from his seat near the back, his broad frame cutting an imposing silhouette against the dim light. His voice sliced through the hum of the crowd, sharp and venomous. "You think you're oppressed? That you're some kind of victim? Let me tell you something, young lady. You don't know the first thing about real struggles." The air turned brittle. Ava froze, her breath catching as gasps erupted around her. Grant stalked forward, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden floor, each step a declaration of authority. "This kind of talk divides people," he snarled, his eyes narrowing into slits. "And you're not going to do that in my school." Ava's pulse roared in her ears, a frantic rhythm. "I have the right to speak," she shot back, her voice trembling but resolute. Grant's lips curled into a sneer. Not anymore. Before she could process his words, his hand clamped around her arm, fingers digging into her skin with bruising force. He yanked her toward the back of the stage, his strides long and unrelenting. Students fumbled for their phones, the soft clicks of cameras and the glow of screens lighting up the room as they recorded every humiliating second. Ava's voice cracked as she tried to protest, "Let go of me!" But Grant ignored her, his grip tightening. They spilled into this hallway, the auditorium's noise fading into a distant roar. Alone now, the confrontation escalated. "You think you can just say whatever you want without consequences?" Grant growled, his face inches from hers, his breath hot and sour. "You need to be put in your place." Ava's chest heaved, her breath hitching. "You can't do this. You're out of line." He didn't respond with words. Instead, he ripped open a drawer in a nearby desk, pulling out a pair of scissors that glinted coldly under the fluorescent lights. "No, you're out of line," he spat, "and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." The metal brushed against her scalp, and Ava's world tilted. Her knees buckled, but she stayed upright, terror and disbelief crashing through her. Students crowded the doorway, their faces pale, eyes wide with shock. Some shouted, "Stop it! Get help!" But their voices were a distant echo, and no one dared step closer. The scissors moved, and strands of her hair drifted to the floor, each snip a violation, a theft of something she couldn't name. Then the front door slammed open, the sound reverberating through the hallway like a gunshot. Silence descended, thick and suffocating. Grant's hand faltered, the scissors trembling as his gaze flicked toward the figure now standing at the entrance. Malcolm Brooks didn't need to speak. His presence alone commanded the space, a towering figure radiating control and fury. His sharp eyes locked onto Ava, taking in the scattered hair. The tears she hadn't realized were streaming down her cheeks, the raw fear etched into every line of her face. Her stomach twisted violently. She wanted to collapse into his arms, to let him sweep her away from this nightmare. But the way he stood, shoulders squared, jaw tight, a storm brewing beneath his calm exterior, rooted her to the spot. Grant broke the silence, his voice strained, defensive. "You can't just barge in here like this. This is a school matter, not a federal one." Malcolm raised a hand, and Grant's words withered mid-sentence. "Let her go." The command was quiet, but unyielding, a blade wrapped in velvet. Grant's fingers twitched, hesitating, before he released Ava's arm. She stumbled back, her legs shaky, catching herself against the wall. Malcolm's gaze never wavered from Grant. "I don't know what you think you're doing here," Grant said, forcing bravado into his tone, though it wavered. "This girl's been out of control, disrupting classes, stirring up division, disrespecting authority. Someone had to humiliate her?" Malcolm's voice cut through Grant's excuses, sharp enough to draw blood. "Someone had to make an example out of her by assaulting her? By cutting her hair?" Grant stiffened, his face flushing red. You don't understand what's been happening in this school. The tension she's causing. The only tension in this hallway is the one you created, Malcolm snapped, his words heavy with accusation. You put your hands on a child, you violated her rights, and you did it because you thought no one would stop you. The crowd of students swelled at the doorway, their phones still rolling, capturing every word, every tremble in Grant's posture. Ava felt their stares like pinpricks, but she couldn't move, couldn't breathe deeply enough to steady herself. Grant's hand drifted to the radio clipped to his shoulder, a reflexive grasp for control. I did what I had to do to maintain order. You abused your power, Malcolm countered, stepping closer, his presence shrinking the space between them. And now you're going to answer for it. Grant retreated a step, his jaw clenching. You're making a mistake, he hissed. You think you can walk in here and take over? I've been enforcing the rules in this school since before. This isn't about rules, Malcolm interrupted, his voice icy, precise. This is about your ego, your racism, your abuse of power. He gestured to the students, their faces a mix of awe and outrage. You thought no one would stop you because you thought no one could, but you were wrong. You were. Grant's breathing quickened, his eyes darting to the crowd, then back to Malcolm. You don't scare me. You should be scared, Malcolm replied, his tone low, lethal. Not of me, but of what comes next. Ava's stomach lurched at those words. There was a finality in her father's voice she'd never heard before, a promise that this wasn't just a standoff, but the beginning of a reckoning. Grant's radio crackled, a burst of static slicing through the tension, and he reached for it instinctively. Malcolm closed the distance, his voice dropping to a whisper only Grant could hear. If you think this ends here, you're wrong. Grant's hand froze, and for the first time Ava saw doubt flicker in his eyes, real, unguarded fear. But he squared his shoulders, defiance flaring. You don't have jurisdiction here, he said through gritted teeth. This is a school matter. Not anymore, Malcolm replied, stepping back and pulling out his phone. His eyes stayed locked on Grant as he dialed, his voice calm but unyielding. I'm requesting immediate backup. I need agents on site for detainment and investigation. Grant's face drained of color. You can't. I can, Malcolm said, cutting him off. And I will. The hallway thickened with tension, students whispering, their phones documenting every fracture in Grant's facade. Ava's heart hammered as she watched his confidence crumble, but it wasn't enough. She wanted him to feel the full weight of his actions. The shame he'd tried to force onto her, the terror he'd inflicted. She wanted justice, not just for herself, but for every moment he'd wielded his power like a weapon. The lesson here stretched beyond the walls of that hallway. Grant's actions weren't just a personal vendetta. They were a stark reminder of what happens when authority goes unchecked, when power is abused under the guise of order. His unraveling wasn't just his downfall. It was a mirror held up to a system that too often lets such men believe they're untouchable. Ava stood there, her breath shallow, her father's presence a steady anchor, and realized this was bigger than her fear, bigger than her pain. It was about consequences, the kind that echo long after the scissors fall silent. In the suffocating stillness of the hallway, Malcolm Brooks stood tall, his broad shoulders cutting an unyielding silhouette against the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. His dark eyes locked onto Officer Grant with an intensity that could have stopped a heartbeat, but his voice remained steady, deliberate, slicing through the thick air like a sharpened blade. Closer to me now, huh? You really believe this ends well for you, Grant? You honestly think you can twist this into some cheap racial narrative and walk away with your hands clean? Malcolm didn't so much as blink, his gaze shifting briefly to his daughter Ava, who stood a few steps behind him, before snapping back to the man in front of him. This isn't about race, not even close. This is about consequences, real, hard consequences. Grant's hand lingered near his belt, fingers twitching as if itching to grab something. His badge, his gun, anything to reassert the authority he'd always worn like armor. But Malcolm didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't give an inch. The hallway felt like a pressure cooker, the walls themselves seeming to lean in as the two men stood toe-to-toe, their breaths mingling in the charged space between them. Neither would yield. The air was heavy, almost alive with tension, vibrating with the unspoken threats hanging between them. Then, like a thunderclap shattering a fragile silence, the piercing wail of sirens erupted outside, slicing through the standoff. Grant's face crumpled, the bravado draining from his features as reality crashed down around him. His lips parted, but no words came, only a shallow, unsteady breath. Ava swallowed hard, her throat tight, her wide eyes darting between her father's unshakable resolve and the officer who, just moments ago, had tried to crush her spirit into dust. She could feel the shift in the room, a seismic ripple as the weight of what was about to unfold settled into her bones. Her hands trembled at her sides, not from fear now, but from the dawning realization that this moment was bigger than her, bigger than Grant, bigger than any single act of cruelty. It was justice, raw and unfiltered, unfurling before her eyes. Grant took a shaky step back, his hands quivering as the first wave of FBI agents stormed into the building. Their polished boots echoed against the tiled floor, a rhythmic march of inevitability. Malcolm didn't budge, his gaze steady as he watched the world tighten its grip around Grant like a noose. The hallway buzzed with chaos, sirens blaring, camera flashes popping from the growing crowd of students, their phones raised like a forest of silent witnesses. Yet Ava couldn't shake the gnawing certainty that this wasn't the end. Something darker, something deeper loomed on the horizon, building like the electric hum before a lightning strike. She could feel it in her gut, sharp and insistent, a warning she couldn't name. The air grew thicker, heavier, as if the tension itself had taken on weight, pressing against the peeling paint of the walls. Every sound seemed amplified, the scuff of nervous feet, the hushed whispers rippling through the onlookers, the cold metallic snap of handcuffs locking around Grant's wrists. He stood frozen, his broad frame shrinking under the scrutiny, his trembling hands betraying the panic he tried to bury. The two agents flanking him were towers of authority, their crisp uniforms pristine, their faces carved from stone, unreadable, untouchable. But Grant's eyes weren't on them. They darted back to Malcolm, who stood just feet away, radiating a quiet, unshakable power that seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. Malcolm's voice cut through the din, low and lethal. "You thought no one would stop you, didn't you? You thought you could trample over whoever you wanted, whenever you wanted, and no one would dare push back." His words weren't a shout. They didn't need to be. They carried the weight of righteous fury, of justice long overdue, and something far more personal, a father's rage. Grant's mouth opened, a weak protest forming, but Malcolm's hand shot up, silencing him before a sound could escape. "No more excuses, no more lies. That badge doesn't shield you anymore." Grant's shoulders stiffened, his jaw clenching as if he could physically hold himself together against the tide crashing over him. "I was doing my job," he muttered, but the confidence that once boomed in his voice had withered to a frail whisper. She was out of control, disrespectful. Someone had to step in. His eyes flicked toward Ava, a fleeting attempt to shift the blame, but it only fueled the fire in Malcolm's chest. "Step in!" Malcolm snapped, his towering frame closing the distance between them, forcing Grant to instinctively lean back. "You didn't step in. You stomped over the line. You humiliated a child in front of her peers. You tried to break her spirit because she dared to stand up to you." His voice was a controlled burn, each word searing into Grant's crumbling defenses. The officer flinched, but defiance flared in his eyes, his voice rising in a desperate counterattack. "She needed to be put in her place. Someone had to stop her from spreading hate and division." Malcolm's eyes blazed, and he took another step forward, his presence overwhelming. "Hate? Division?" He gestured sharply toward the students lining the hall, their phones still recording, their faces a mix of shock and anger. "Look at them. Look at her." He pointed to Ava, who stood pale but resolute, her steady gaze locked on Grant like a quiet storm gathering strength. "Does she look like the one spreading hate? Or do you?" Grant's eyes flickered with something close to panic, his footing slipping as he scrambled for control. "You don't get it," he stammered, words tumbling out in a rush. "The pressure in this school. The rules are falling apart. Kids like her think they can say whatever they want, do whatever they want." "Kids like her?" Malcolm's voice sharpened, cutting through the noise like a guillotine. "You mean black kids? Kids who stand up for themselves. Kids who refuse to bow when people like you try to shove them down." Grant's face flushed crimson, his lips pressing into a thin line, but Malcolm didn't relent. "You didn't do this to enforce rules. You did it to send a message. Well, guess what? I'm sending one right back." The crowd shifted, their murmurs swelling as the agents tightened their grip on Grant's arms. Malcolm's voice dropped to a whisper, meant only for the man before him. "You thought you were untouchable. You thought no one could reach you. But you forgot one thing. You crossed the wrong person." Grant's breath hitched, his eyes darting wildly toward the agents now murmuring into their radios. He jerked back, but Malcolm leaned in closer, his voice calm, yet razor-sharp. "Don't fight it. It's over." Grant's defiance flared one last time, his voice trembling with fury. "This isn't over. You can't just storm in here and tear me down. I've given years to this job. I've earned this position." Malcolm's jaw tightened, but his gaze never wavered. "You didn't earn it. You abused it." Grant's fists clenched, but the agents gave him no room to move. One began reciting his rights in a flat, mechanical tone, but Grant's focus stayed riveted on Malcolm. "You're going to regret this," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You're making a mistake." Malcolm's response was steady, unshaken. "The only mistake I made was not stopping you sooner." The crowd pressed closer, phones capturing every word, every tremble in Grant's frame. Students whispered, some in disbelief, others in quiet triumph. Ava stood at the edge of it all, her breath shallow, her chest tight as she watched the man who'd tried to crush her now cuffed and cornered. It should have felt like victory, but the relief she'd expected didn't come. Grant's voice broke through again, ragged and defiant. "You think this ends with me? You think this school doesn't have my back? These parents, these teachers, they'll stand with me, they'll fight for me." Ava's heart twisted, doubt creeping in, but Malcolm didn't falter. "Let them," he said, his voice a quiet thunder. "Because after today, everyone will know exactly who you are, and so will they." Grant's breath quickened, his bravado crumbling. "You don't scare me," he spat, but the words rang hollow, lacking the strength to convince even himself. Malcolm leaned in one final time, his whisper chilling. "You should be scared. Not of me, but of what's coming next." Before Grant could respond, the agents began leading him away. His boots scraped against the floor, a harsh, uneven sound that echoed as the crowd parted like a reluctant sea. Some students whispered, others stared in stunned silence, their eyes trailing him until he vanished through the double doors. Ava's gaze lingered on the empty space where he'd stood, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. Malcolm turned to her then, his hard edges softening as their eyes met. She opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat, trapped by the weight of everything she'd just witnessed. He stepped closer, his voice gentle now. "You're okay. It's over." But Ava shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "No, it's not." Malcolm's brow furrowed, concern flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean?" She swallowed hard, the truth pressing down on her like a physical force. "He's not the only one. The teachers, the staff, everyone who let this happen, they're still here. And they're still letting it happen." Malcolm's expression darkened, but he nodded slowly, a silent promise forming between them. "Then we'll deal with them too." For the first time, Ava felt the knot in her chest loosen, though only slightly. The hallway began to empty, the agents disappearing into the distance, their footsteps fading into the hum of the school. She stood near the edge of the dwindling crowd, her hands unclenching at her sides, her eyes fixed on the spot where Grant had been. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid to face what lay ahead. The air still crackled with the aftermath, the echoes of justice and the promise of more to come, lingering like a storm that refused to break. Ava stood rooted to the spot, her body trembling as though the tension coursing through her veins might shatter her completely. Her chest felt tight, a suffocating knot twisting inside her, refusing to let go even as the echoes of Officer Grant's departure faded down the hall. She could still see him in her mind's eye, his wrists locked in cold steel cuffs, his face contorted with a mixture of terror and disbelief. His wild, darting eyes had searched the crowd for a lifeline, some shred of mercy that wasn't there. But instead of satisfaction, instead of the relief she'd imagined, Ava felt only the relentless hammering of her heart against her ribcage, drowning out the murmurs of the onlookers around her. It was as if her body refused to believe the nightmare had ended, as if it knew something deeper, something uglier, still lingered unresolved. Beside her, Malcolm Brooks stood like a pillar carved from stone, unyielding, steady, yet sharp-edged in a way that didn't soothe her frayed nerves. His presence wasn't a balm. It was a brace, a silent promise of strength for whatever collision was still to come. The words they'd exchanged just moments ago hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy with unspoken meaning, their weight pressing down on both of them. He shifted slightly, his dark eyes flickering toward her, and when he spoke, his voice cut through the chaos of her thoughts. Low, deliberate, each syllable measured like a man choosing his steps across a minefield. "It's over," he said, his tone firm but lacking the closure she so desperately craved. The words felt hollow, a temporary patch over a wound too deep to heal with platitudes. Ava's head shook before she could stop it, a visceral rejection of his assurance. "No, it's not," she whispered, the words tumbling out faster than she could catch them, raw and jagged with the truth she'd been holding inside. Malcolm turned fully toward her now, his sharp gaze narrowing as it traced her face, searching for answers she wasn't sure she could articulate. "What do you mean it's not?" he asked, his voice softening just enough to reveal a flicker of concern, though the steel beneath it remained, an edge honed by years of battles fought and scars earned. She swallowed hard, her throat tight with the storm of emotions raging inside her, anger, fear, betrayal, all clawing their way to the surface. "Because it wasn't just him," she said, her voice trembling but gaining strength as the dam broke. "It was never just him. Everyone saw what he was doing, the teachers, the principal, all of them. They watched it happen." Her words spilled out in a rush now, fueled by a fury she could no longer contain. "They saw him strutting through the halls, targeting students, humiliating us, me, and they turned away. Or worse, they covered for him. They told us to respect him, to follow the rules, to stop making waves. They let him wield his badge like a blade, cutting us down while they stood by and did nothing." Malcolm's face darkened as she spoke, the lines of his jaw tightening until the muscle twitched beneath his skin. He didn't interrupt her, didn't try to smooth over her anger with empty reassurances. He just listened, his silence a rare gift that let her rage breathe, let it fill the space between them. "They knew," Ava pressed on, her voice rising, sharp and accusing. "They saw him corner kids in the corridors, saw him mock us until we felt like nothing. And when I spoke up, when I dared to say it was wrong, they turned it on me. They made me the villain, the troublemaker, just for refusing to stay silent. And now he's gone. Grant's gone, but they're still here. They're still letting it happen, and no one's holding them accountable." Her words hung there, quivering with the weight of her pain, and for a moment, the air felt too thick to breathe. Malcolm's hand found her shoulder then, a gentle pressure that barely registered through the fire consuming her. She didn't pull away, but she couldn't stop either. The anger poured out like a river breaking its banks. "They acted like I was the problem," she said, her voice cracking under the strain. "Like I was the one disrupting everything, just because I wouldn't bow my head and take it. And even now, with him in cuffs, it doesn't feel like justice. It feels like a pause, a break before they find someone else to take his place." Malcolm's grip tightened slightly, grounding her as her words threatened to unravel her completely. When he spoke, his voice was low but steady, a lifeline thrown into the chaos of her spiraling thoughts. "We will stop them," he said, his tone carrying a quiet ferocity that sliced through her panic. Not just him, all of them. His eyes locked onto hers, unwavering, and for the first time, she glimpsed the depth of his resolve. Not just a father's protective instinct, but a man who'd seen too much injustice to let it stand. Before she could respond, the sharp clatter of footsteps broke the moment, hurried and uneven against the tiled floor. Principal Hastings emerged from the shadowed hallway, his face pale and glistening with sweat that beaded along his receding hairline. He tugged at his tie with jittery fingers, trying to compose himself, but his movements betrayed him. Nervous, skittish, like a man teetering on the edge of a cliff. His eyes darted briefly toward Ava, then skittered away, settling on Malcolm instead. "Mr. Brooks," he began, his voice thin and strained, forcing a calm he clearly didn't feel. "We need to talk about what just happened. This situation, it's complicated." Malcolm's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening as he turned to face the principal fully. "The situation," he repeated, his voice sharp enough to cut glass, "is already being handled. Or did you miss the part where Officer Grant was escorted out of here in handcuffs?" His words dripped with contempt, each one a challenge that Hastings couldn't dodge. The principal swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as his gaze flicked nervously between Malcolm and Ava. "Yes, of course," he stammered, his hands rising in a feeble attempt to placate them. "But there are protocols we need to follow, procedures." "Protocols?" Malcolm's voice slashed through the excuse like a whip, his patience evaporating. "You're talking about protocols now? After you let that man terrorize students in your school for months? After you let this happen to my daughter?" His tone was a blade, honed and lethal, and Hastings flinched as though struck. The principal's hands hovered in the air, palms out, a desperate shield against the accusations raining down on him. "No one wanted this to happen," he protested weakly, "but we can't just rush into accusations." "The school's reputation," Ava interjected, her voice trembling but razor-sharp, cutting through his flimsy defense before Malcolm could respond. Hastings recoiled, his eyes widening as she stepped forward, her anger surging anew. "That's what you're worried about, isn't it? The school's reputation?" Her words grew louder, each one a hammer striking nails into the coffin of his excuses. "Do you have any idea what it felt like to sit there while he cut my hair in front of everyone? To stand there helpless while he laughed and made me feel like I was nothing? Do you know what it's like to be treated like you don't belong? Like you're the problem just for existing?" Hastings' mouth opened, but no words came. His face crumpled, a mask of guilt and panic. But Ava wasn't done. Her voice broke, raw with fury and pain, yet she pressed on. "You knew what he was doing. You saw it. Every time he singled me out, every time he humiliated me, and you let it happen. You defended him. You let him turn his authority into a weapon, and now you're standing here sweating over the school's image instead of the lives he ruined." Malcolm stepped in then, his presence a towering shadow at her side, his voice low and unyielding. "She's right," he said, his eyes boring into Hastings with an intensity that made the man shrink. "You knew. And now you're going to answer for it. You and every single person who turned a blind eye." His words were a promise, not a threat, delivered with the calm certainty of a man who'd already set the wheels of justice in motion. Hastings stumbled back a step, his voice faltering as he grasped for a defense. This isn't what it looks like. We didn't know it had gotten this bad." "You knew." Malcolm cut him off, his tone dropping to a dangerous whisper, each word heavy with finality. "And there's already an investigation, not just into Grant, but into this entire administration. Every ignored report, every student who felt unsafe, every excuse you made to protect him, it's all coming to light." Hastings' eyes widened, his breath hitching as the weight of Malcolm's words sank in. "You can't," he began, his voice cracking, but Malcolm didn't let him finish. "I already did," he said, his gaze unrelenting, pinning the principal in place until he turned and fled. his trembling hands fumbling for his phone as he disappeared around the corner, muttering about calling the school board. Ava's chest heaved, her breaths shallow and ragged, as the reality of the confrontation settled over her like a heavy fog. She turned to Malcolm, her voice quieter now but still quaking with emotion. "What happens now?" she asked, searching his face for something solid to hold on to. He met her gaze, his eyes steady but burdened with the weight of their shared fight. "We keep going," he said simply, his voice a quiet vow. "We make sure no one ever goes through this again." She nodded, a small gesture, but her mind was already racing ahead. The hallway had emptied out, the crowd dispersing like smoke, but the tension remained, a palpable force that clung to the walls, the floor, the very air she breathed. Her hands still shook, though the weight of Grant's removal had lifted some of the pressure from her shoulders. Yet relief eluded her, chased away by the memories that refused to fade. The faces of the students who'd watched her humiliation unfold, some with phones raised to capture every agonizing second, none with the courage to intervene. That silence, that complicity, gnawed at her, a wound deeper than Grant's cruelty alone. Malcolm stayed close, his presence a constant anchor as his eyes swept the room, his thoughts clearly stretching beyond this moment. She could sense it. He wasn't finished, and neither was she. The fight wasn't over, and that truth settled into her bones with a mix of dread and determination. She didn't want it to end, not yet, not while so many others had played a role in her suffering. Hastings returned minutes later, his steps slow and hesitant, his shoulders slumped as though he carried the weight of his own reckoning. He avoided Ava's gaze, his eyes fixed on Malcolm instead, his voice brittle as he spoke. "I've spoken with the school board," he said, though the nervous tremor in his tone betrayed his fear. "They're concerned about the optics of all this. We need to manage the narrative carefully." "The narrative?" Malcolm's voice snapped like a whip, cutting the principal off mid-sentence. His eyes blazed with a fury that made Hastings shrink back. "You think this is about optics? This is about accountability. You allowed this to happen, under your watch, and now you're scrambling to save face instead of owning up to it." The lesson here stretched far beyond Grant's arrest, beyond the cuffs that had dragged him away. It was about justice, raw, unyielding, and long overdue, and the bitter consequences of power misused. Ava felt it in her marrow. Every adult who'd looked away, every authority figure who'd shielded Grant, had built a system that thrived on silence and fear. But that system was cracking now, exposed by her voice and Malcolm's resolve. And as the echoes of their confrontation lingered in the empty hallway, Ava knew this was only the beginning, a fight not just for her, but for every student who'd been crushed under the weight of unchecked authority. The air in the hallway hung thick and heavy, charged with the echoes of confrontation as Principal Hastings stood there, his face drained of color, his breath shallow and uneven. Sweat glistened on his forehead, betraying the panic clawing at his insides. "This all happened under your watch," Malcolm had said earlier, his words slicing through the tension like a blade. "And now you're fretting about how it looks?" Hastings swallowed hard, his throat tightening as if the truth itself were lodged there, choking him. "I'm not trying to dodge responsibility," he stammered, his voice trembling with a mix of desperation and dread. "But you've got to see the bigger picture. The fallout's coming. Reporters are already swarming outside. Parents are blowing up the phone lines, demanding answers. If we don't get a grip on this, it's going to spiral out of control." His hands fidgeted at his sides, fingers twitching as he fought to hold on to some semblance of authority that was slipping through his grasp like sand. Malcolm didn't flinch. He stepped closer, his tall frame casting a shadow over Hastings, his voice dropping to a low, steely growl that carried an unshakable resolve. "You don't control anything anymore," he said, each word deliberate, cutting deeper than the last. "Not after today. Your first thought should have been the safety of these kids, not your precious reputation. And the fact that it wasn't? That's exactly why this investigation isn't stopping with Grant." Hastings' eyes widened, the color draining further from his already ashen face as the weight of Malcolm's words crashed into him. "Investigation," he croaked, his voice barely a whisper, as if saying the word aloud might make it more real. "You can't seriously—" "I already have agents digging through records," Malcolm interrupted, his tone unrelenting, his dark eyes boring into Hastings with an intensity that left no room for doubt. "Complaints that were filed and forgotten, disciplinary actions that were brushed aside, reports that were buried under layers of excuses. This isn't just about Grant. It's about a rotting culture here at Alt that let him strut around unchecked, that let him think he could do whatever he wanted without consequence. And the more you squirm and deflect, the uglier it's going to get for you." His words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding, a promise of justice that felt both inevitable and overdue. Ava stood a few feet away, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching as Hastings' shoulders slumped under the crushing weight of Malcolm's accusation. His posture crumpled, his once stiff spine bending as if the burden of his failures had become a physical thing pressing down on him. But sympathy? Ava felt none of it. Not a flicker. Her heart pounded in her chest, a furious rhythm fueled by years of bottled-up rage and betrayal. She stepped forward, her voice slicing through the stifling air like a whip. "What happens to the teachers who propped him up?" she demanded, her tone sharp and unapologetic, her eyes blazing with a fire that had been smoldering for too long. "The ones who turned a blind eye, who made excuses for him, do they just get to stay? Do they get to act like they didn't know exactly what he was doing?" Her words trembled with emotion, but they were steady enough to cut deep. Malcolm turned to her, his stern expression softening just a fraction, a glimmer of understanding flickering in his gaze. But Ava wasn't done, not even close. Her voice rose, quivering with a mix of anger and resolve. "I don't want this to just fade away," she said, her hands clenching into fists at her sides, nails digging into her palms as she fought to keep her composure. "I don't want them to slink off and pretend none of this ever happened. Because if they do, nothing changes. Nothing ever will." Her chest heaved with the effort of holding back the tears that threatened to spill over, but her eyes remained dry, locked on Hastings with a fierce intensity. Hastings opened his mouth, his lips parting as if he might muster some feeble defense, but Malcolm cut him off again, his voice a quiet thunder. "It's not going to fade away," he said, his gaze shifting to Ava, steady and reassuring. "I'll make damn sure of that." Hastings took a faltering step back, his eyes darting between them, uncertainty flickering in their depths like a cornered animal sensing the trap closing in. "I just need time," he muttered, his voice cracking. "Time to figure out how to handle this." "Time!" Malcolm snapped, his patience evaporating in an instant. "You've had too much time already, and you squandered it." His words were a hammer striking an anvil, each one ringing with finality. Ava took a step closer, her breath quickening as she leveled her gaze at Hastings. "You didn't protect us," she said, her voice rising, raw and jagged with pain. "You protected him, and now you're scrambling to save yourself. But what about the students he crushed? What about the ones who had no one to fight for them?" Her words poured out like a flood breaking through a dam, unstoppable and fierce. Hastings finally met her eyes, and for a moment his face crumpled, lines deepening as if her words were a physical weight pressing down on him. He looked like a man staring into the abyss of his own making, the realization of his complicity sinking in. But Ava wasn't finished. "Do you even have a clue what it feels like?" she pressed, her voice dropping to a hoarse, trembling whisper. "To sit there while someone rips your dignity away piece by piece? To feel so powerless while everyone just watches, doing nothing? I'm not the only one he did this to, and you let it happen." Her hands shook at her sides, but her stare never wavered, pinning him in place. Malcolm's voice followed hers, cold and precise, a blade honed to a razor's edge. "And now you're going to answer for it." Hastings' shoulders sagged further, his breath hitching as the fight drained out of him. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice small and defeated, a shadow of the man who'd once wielded authority like a scepter. "You're going to cooperate," Malcolm said, his tone calm but unyielding, a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. You're going to hand over every file, every report, every email, everything. And you'd better start bracing yourself because when this is over, you might not have a desk to sit behind anymore. Hastings' mouth opened again, but no sound came out. His eyes flickered with a raw, visceral fear. The fear of a man who knew the walls were closing in, the ground crumbling beneath his feet. He turned and shuffled away, his footsteps uneven, fading into the distance like the last gasps of a dying regime. Malcolm stepped closer to Ava, his voice dropping to a softer register. "You okay?" he asked, genuine concern threading through the question. Ava shook her head, her throat tight. "No," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I will be." Malcolm nodded, but she could see the tension still etched into the lines of his face, the fire in his eyes that said he wasn't done fighting. Neither was she. The sound of hurried footsteps broke the moment, and Ava turned to see Maya approaching, her face pale but resolute, her dark hair falling in messy strands across her forehead. She didn't say a word, just stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Ava, pulling her into a fierce, wordless embrace. Ava felt her shoulders loosen, the unbearable weight of the day settling into something more bearable as Maya's warmth anchored her.
"They're not getting away with this,"
Maya murmured, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Ava nodded against her shoulder. "Not this time." Malcolm watched them for a moment, his sharp eyes softening at the edges, a rare glimpse of something human breaking through his steely exterior. He reached for his phone and stepped away, his voice dropping to a low, deliberate cadence as he began making calls, setting wheels in motion, ensuring that no one could bury this mess under the rug again. Ava knew what he was doing, building a case, brick by brick, that would hold everyone accountable. But as she stood there in the empty hallway, her thoughts raced uncontrollably. She thought of the other students, the ones who'd stayed silent, the ones who'd averted their eyes when Grant humiliated her and others, the ones who'd laughed along or cheered him on. This wasn't just about Grant or Hastings or even the teachers who'd enabled him. It was about a whole system of silence, a web of complicity that had let injustice fester like a wound. Her chest tightened, but this time it wasn't fear. It was a burning, unshakable determination. She wasn't done fighting. Not yet. The echoes of Hastings' retreat faded into an eerie stillness, the hallway stretching out before her like a battlefield after the smoke had cleared. Her pulse still thundered in her ears, her hands clammy and cold, the weight in her chest a stubborn, immovable thing. Malcolm stood nearby, his phone pressed to his ear, barking orders in a tone that left no room for negotiation. She could see the strain in his posture, the way his jaw clenched, the way his shoulders squared as if he were holding up the world. It was both comforting and unnerving, a reminder that the fight was far from over. Maya stayed close, her presence a lifeline in the chaos. Even so, Ava felt the enormity of what had happened pressing down on her, threatening to drag her under. Her eyes drifted to the spot where Officer Grant had stood earlier, his smug defiance shattering the moment the handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. That first rush of satisfaction had quickly soured into something hollow, a bitter aftertaste that lingered.
"You should sit down,"
Maya said gently, her voice cutting through the fog in Ava's mind. Ava shook her head, her response sharper than she intended.
"I don't want to sit. I can't sit."
Maya's expression softened, her brown eyes warm with understanding.
"You're shaking,"
she pointed out, nodding toward Ava's hands. Ava glanced down and saw the truth of it, her fingers trembling uncontrollably, as if her body hadn't yet caught up to her mind. She balled them into fists, willing the shaking to stop.
"I'm fine,"
she said, but the lie tasted bitter on her tongue. Maya didn't push her. She just stayed there, a quiet, steady presence.
"You don't have to be fine," she said softly. "Not right now."
Ava's breath caught, and she turned away, her eyes stinging with unshed tears.
"I just keep thinking about how everyone watched,"
she whispered, her voice so quiet it barely reached her own ears.
"They saw what he was doing and not one of them did anything."
Maya stepped closer, her words measured but firm.
They were scared, Ava, just like you were.
But I couldn't move, Ava said, her voice breaking. I couldn't do anything. And the worst part? For a second, I thought maybe he was right. Maybe I did deserve it.
Maya's tone sharpened, cutting through Ava's spiral.
Don't you dare say that. Don't you let him win.
Ava's shoulders trembled as she let out a shaky breath, and Maya stepped in front of her, forcing her to meet her gaze.
You didn't deserve any of this. He did this.
And so did everyone who let him think he could get away with it. Malcolm's voice broke through as he ended his call and approached them. They won't get away with it, he said, his tone heavy with certainty. The investigation's already rolling. Grant's facing charges, and the school's going to answer for every report they ignored. Ava looked up at him, her voice unsteady.
What if it's not enough? What if nothing changes?
Malcolm's expression softened, but the fire in his eyes burned brighter.
It will. It has to.
Ava's stomach twisted, doubt gnawing at her like a relentless beast. She wanted to believe him, needed to, but the memories of Grant's sneering face, his casual cruelty, kept clawing at her. The way he'd looked at her like she was nothing, like he had every right to tear her down, and how no one had stopped him. This wasn't just about one man's abuse of power, it was about the consequences that rippled out from it, the justice that had been denied for too long. And as she stood there, flanked by Maya's quiet strength and Malcolm's fierce resolve, Ava knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't let silence win again. Not ever. The air in the hallway hung heavy, thick with tension that seemed to cling to every surface. The scuffed linoleum floor, the faded posters curling at the edges, the lockers standing like silent sentinels along the walls. Ava stood there, her chest tight, her breath shallow, as the echoes of what had just happened reverberated through her mind. She could still feel the weight of it all pressing down on her, the suffocating realization that stopping him, Grant, might not have been the end of anything. What if there were others like him lurking in the shadows? What if this was merely the first crack in a dam about to burst? Her thoughts spiraled, dark and relentless, and she barely noticed Malcolm watching her until his voice broke through the storm in her head. "I know you're scared," he said, his tone softening like a man trying to coax a wounded animal out of hiding. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but this doesn't stop with him. It doesn't stop today." His words were steady, but there was a tremor beneath them, a hint of something raw that Ava hadn't expected from someone like him, someone who always seemed so unshakable. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, her voice cracking as she forced the words out. "I just want to feel safe." The admission felt like a confession, vulnerable and jagged, and for a fleeting moment, Malcolm's carefully constructed armor faltered. His face fell, his eyes flickering with a quiet anguish, and when he spoke again, his voice quivered ever so slightly. "You will," he said. But it didn't land like a promise. It drifted like a fragile hope, carried on the wind of uncertainty. The distant murmur of voices snapped them back to reality, pulling Ava's gaze down the hall. Teachers were clustering now, their whispers sharp and hurried, their eyes darting toward her before skittering away like startled birds. She could feel their unease, their judgment, and it made her skin prickle. Malcolm turned toward them, his broad shoulders cutting an imposing figure, and with nothing more than his presence, he sent them scattering like shadows fleeing the light. Maya, standing close enough that Ava could feel the warmth of her arm, leaned in, her voice low and conspiratorial. "They're scared of you." Ava's lips pressed into a tight, bitter line, and she muttered, "Good." Malcolm glanced back at her, his expression unreadable but his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "This isn't over yet, Ava. You know that, right?" She nodded, her voice steadier this time, though her heart still hammered against her ribs. "I know." The sound of footsteps grew louder, a rhythmic thudding that made Ava's head snap toward the end of the hall. A group of agents had returned, their suits crisp but their faces etched with grim determination. One of them approached Malcolm, his voice hushed but urgent, and though Ava strained to catch every word, only fragments broke through the din. Reports pouring in, multiple complaints.
Possible negligence charges. Malcolm's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as he gave a curt nod.
Make sure nothing's buried, he ordered, his tone clipped and unyielding.
The agent responded with a sharp nod of his own before vanishing down the corridor, leaving Malcolm standing there, his shoulders rigid with tension. Ava took a tentative step closer, her voice trembling despite her efforts to steady it. What happens now? His gaze met hers, sharp and piercing, and for a moment she felt the full weight of his resolve. Now, he said, we make sure every single person who let this happen answers for it. Her pulse quickened, a frantic drumbeat in her chest. She wanted to believe it could be that simple, that justice could swoop in and right every wrong. But a gnawing doubt coiled deep in her gut. The people who had turned a blind eye, who had let Grant's abuses fester unchecked, weren't the type to surrender quietly. They'd fight, clawing and scrambling to protect themselves, and the thought made her stomach twist. But she wouldn't back down either. Maya's hand brushed her arm, a quiet gesture of solidarity, and her voice was soft but firm. Whatever happens, you're not doing this alone. Ava nodded, her chest still trembling but her resolve hardening. I know. Malcolm's phone buzzed again, a harsh vibration that cut through the moment. He stepped away to answer it, his voice turning sharp and commanding as he barked orders into the receiver. Ava's eyes swept the hallway, taking in the faces of the teachers and students still lingering like ghosts. Some watched her with guilt etched into their features, their eyes downcast as if they couldn't bear to meet her gaze. Others looked relieved, grateful that they hadn't been the ones caught in the crosshairs of this nightmare. Her hands clenched into fists, her nails biting into her palms, not out of fear this time, but out of a burning determination that surged through her veins. Maya's voice broke through again, gentle but unwavering. You're not done, are you? Ava shook her head, her tone resolute. Not even close. The hallway seemed to grow colder, the air sharpening as the buzz of voices swelled. At the far end, teachers huddled in tight knots, their whispers slicing through the silence like shards of glass. Some stole glances at Ava, only to look away the moment her eyes met theirs, as if acknowledging her might drag them into the tempest swirling around her. She stood rooted to the spot, her heart pounding so fiercely she could feel it in her throat, her thoughts racing too fast to grasp. Malcolm was still on his call, pacing a few feet away, each step deliberate, each word measured. The tension in his shoulders was palpable, a silent testament to the burden he carried, the weight of every choice, every move he made in this unraveling chaos. But even that couldn't untangle the knot of dread tightening in Ava's stomach. Maya stayed by her side, a steady anchor in the storm. But even her presence couldn't quell the flood of emotions threatening to drown Ava. Anger that burned like wildfire, frustration that gnawed at her resolve, and a deeper, more insidious fear. It wasn't Grant she feared anymore. He was gone, a monster felled. No, this was a fear of what loomed ahead, of a future where this fight might not change a thing, where the bystanders who'd enabled him slipped through the cracks unscathed. Her fists tightened, her nails digging deeper until she felt the sting, and she vowed silently to herself she wouldn't let that happen. Malcolm ended his call with a sharp snap of his phone, turning back to her. His face was a mask, unreadable, but his eyes gleamed with a fierce intensity that made her pulse race faster. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating, until he finally closed the distance between them. I need you to be ready for what comes next, he said, his voice low but ironclad. Ava swallowed hard, forcing the lump in her throat down. I'm ready. His gaze softened for a heartbeat, a fleeting crack in his stoic facade, before it vanished. This isn't over, he continued. The investigation's moving fast, but it's going to get messy. People are going to start pointing fingers, trying to save their own skins, even if it means dragging someone else down with them. Her stomach lurched, a sickening twist of dread. What if they come after me? She asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Malcolm didn't flinch, his voice steady as stone. They won't. Not while I'm here. She wanted to cling to that assurance, to let it soothe the doubt gnawing at her edges, but a whisper of uncertainty lingered.
And what about the others? She pressed.
The teachers who defended him? The ones who looked the other way? Malcolm's expression darkened, but his tone remained even. They're already being questioned. If they had any part in this, they'll face consequences. Ava shook her head, frustration bubbling up. That's not enough. Consequences don't fix what they did. They don't erase the fact that they let this happen. His voice dropped, heavy with a quiet gravity. No, they don't. But it's a start. Before she could argue, a new voice sliced through the clamor, sharp and accusatory. You think this fixes everything? Ava and Malcolm turned to see Mrs. Reynolds, one of Ava's teachers, standing a few feet away. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, but her face betrayed a flicker of unease she couldn't quite mask. Ava's chest tightened, her breath catching as she snapped, "What's that supposed to mean?" Mrs. Reynolds's voice hardened, though it wavered at the edges. You think tearing this school apart is going to make things better? You think dragging everyone through the mud is going to fix what happened to you? Malcolm stepped forward, his presence looming like a thundercloud, his tone cutting like a blade. Are you seriously trying to blame her for this? Mrs. Reynolds flinched, a quick jerk of her shoulders, but she didn't retreat. I'm saying this school isn't perfect, she shot back. But what happened today didn't start with Grant, and it's not going to end with him either. Maybe instead of trying to burn everything down, you should think about what comes after. Ava's voice cracked as she stepped forward, her emotions spilling over. What comes after? What comes after is kids feeling safe. What comes after is people like you not turning your backs when something's wrong. Mrs. Reynolds's composure faltered, her voice trembling. It's not that simple. Ava's reply was a whip crack, fierce and unyielding. It is that simple. You saw what he was doing. You saw how he treated people, and you did nothing. And now you're worried about the school instead of the people he hurt? Malcolm cut in before Mrs. Reynolds could respond, his voice a low growl. You're done here. The teacher hesitated, her face flushing a deep crimson as Malcolm advanced, his presence unyielding. You're part of the problem, he said, his words measured but razor-sharp. And if you can't see that, you don't belong here. Mrs. Reynolds faltered, then turned abruptly, her footsteps echoing down the hall as she fled around the corner. Ava's hands still trembled, but this time it was rage coursing through her, a righteous fury that burned hotter with every breath. Malcolm turned back to her, his voice softening, though it carried a weary edge. I know this doesn't feel like enough, but we're not finished. Her eyes stung, tears threatening to spill, but she nodded fiercely. I know. And I'm not finished either. Maya stepped closer, her presence a quiet strength, her voice steady as a heartbeat. You don't have to do this alone. Ava's breath hitched, and for the first time her shoulders eased, the weight lifting just enough to let her breathe. I know, she said, and this time the words felt solid, rooted in something unshakable. The sound of more footsteps filled the hall, a steady cadence that drew Ava's attention. The agents were back, their faces carved with seriousness, their movements purposeful. Malcolm stepped forward to meet them, speaking in hushed tones as Ava and Maya hung back, their eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before them. Maya's voice broke the silence, soft but piercing. Does it feel real yet? Ava exhaled slowly, the breath shuddering out of her. No, but maybe it doesn't have to, not yet. The agents dispersed down the hall and Malcolm turned back to her, his expression resolute. Come on, he said, his voice firm but not unkind. We're not done. Ava nodded, her resolve steeling as she took a step forward. The hallway stretched out before her, cold and unyielding, but she wasn't alone. Not anymore. And as the echoes of footsteps faded, she felt the ember of justice glowing brighter within her. A reminder that power, when abused, inevitably faced consequences. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but she was ready for the fight ahead. Her boots thudded against the polished floor, heavier now than they'd ever been, each step reverberating through her body like a drumbeat of resolve. Ava held her chin high, her posture unyielding despite the invisible weight pressing against her shoulders. A burden woven from countless moments of doubt, fear, and defiance. It wasn't crushing, though. No, it burned inside her. A fire stoked by every hushed whisper she'd overheard in the halls, every sidelong glance from teachers who'd pretended not to see, every flicker of uncertainty in the eyes of her classmates. Those memories didn't drag her down. They propelled her forward, fueling her determination that this fight, her fight, would not end here. She didn't glance back as she and her father stepped out of the school's shadowed corridor and into the storm awaiting them. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time the unknown didn't terrify her. It sharpened her focus, steadying her for whatever lay ahead. The courtroom buzzed with restless energy, every wooden bench packed tight with bodies, reporters scribbling furiously, parents clutching each other's hands, students shifting nervously, and community members who'd tracked the case since the day Officer Grant's wrists had been bound by cold steel. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation, pressing against Ava's chest like a vice. But this time it didn't choke her. It ignited something deep within, a spark of purpose that kept her upright. She sat beside her father, Malcolm, whose calm exterior masked the storm brewing beneath. His broad shoulders were rigid, betraying the tension he carried, and though his face remained a mask of composure, Ava caught the fleeting glint of pride and pain in his dark eyes. This wasn't just her moment. It belonged to every student who'd ever shrunk into the shadows, every voice that had been stifled, every second she'd wondered if standing up would break her. Across the room, Grant sat motionless, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles blanched white, his once proud features now gaunt and drained. The swagger that had defined him, the arrogance that had emboldened him to wield his power like a weapon, had evaporated, leaving behind a shell of a man, hollowed out by his own undoing. Ava's gaze lingered on him, unflinching. Pity didn't stir in her heart, not after the wreckage he'd left behind. Not after the flood of stories that had poured out during the investigation, tales of students cornered, mocked, and stripped of their dignity, their cries ignored for far too long. The evidence had mounted swiftly, a landslide of damning truths that tore apart the carefully constructed mask Grant had worn for years. When the judge's gavel struck, silencing the murmurs that rippled through the room, his voice boomed with authority, delivering the verdict. Guilty on multiple counts. The words hung in the air, sharp and final, slicing through the tension like a blade. Ava exhaled, a slow, shuddering breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding since that fateful day in the hallway. A smile didn't cross her lips. Not yet, but the crushing weight that had shadowed her for months began to dissolve, drifting away like ash in the wind. As Grant was led out, his cuffs clinking faintly, his eyes darted toward her for a fleeting second. There was no fire left in them, no venom, no resistance, just the dull, defeated acknowledgement of a man who'd lost everything. Ava didn't avert her gaze. She wanted him to see her there, unbroken, unwavering, a living testament to his fall. Malcolm's hand settled on her shoulder, warm and steady, grounding her as the crowd began to thin. "It's done," he murmured, his voice low but resonant, carrying the weight of a father who'd fought alongside her. She nodded, but deep down she knew this was only the first chapter. The investigation had unearthed a rot far deeper than anyone had imagined. Teachers who'd feigned blindness, administrators who'd buried complaints under layers of paperwork, and a web of prejudice that stretched into the school's very foundation. Principal Hastings had been the first to crumble, resigning before the hearings could even begin, his name now a stain on the town's history. Whispers followed him, rumors of desperate attempts to salvage his career in another district, only to be met with slammed doors and cold shoulders. Ava felt no sympathy for him. He'd chosen silence, chosen power over justice, and now he'd reaped the consequences of that betrayal. Several teachers faced their own reckonings. Some were dismissed outright, others shuffled off to lesser roles. But the scars they'd left on their students wouldn't fade with a mere signature on a disciplinary form. Outside the courthouse, Maya waited, her eyes alight with a mix of pride and relief, a quiet strength radiating from her small frame. She didn't say a word at first, just stepped forward and wrapped Ava in a fierce embrace. For the first time in weeks, Ava let herself sink into it, the warmth of her friend's arms a lifeline amid the chaos.
You did it,
Maya whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Ava pulled back, shaking her head gently.
We did it,
she corrected, her tone firm but soft, a recognition of the countless hands that had lifted her when she'd faltered. The months that followed spun by in a blur of motion and noise. Ava's story rippled far beyond their sleepy town, igniting a wildfire of change. Protests erupted, petitions circulated, and school districts scrambled to enact reforms. New training programs sprang up, oversight tightened, and protections for students grew teeth, all born from the ashes of her fight. Ava found herself thrust into the spotlight, microphones shoved in her face, lawmakers seeking her input, crowds hanging on her every word. At first, the attention felt like a tidal wave threatening to swallow her whole. But as the days turned to weeks, it morphed into something else. Purpose. Grant's sentencing came down hard, as it deserved to. Assault, harassment, abuse of power, locking him behind bars for years. When he emerged, if he ever did, the badge he'd once flaunted would be nothing but a distant memory. Ava didn't dwell on him, though. Her eyes were fixed forward on the promise of a future where no one else would endure what she had. Hastings faded into the margins, a ghost of his former self, his ambitions reduced to whispers of failure. She spared him no thought. He'd sown his fate, and now he'd live it. Maya remained her rock, a constant presence reminding Ava to pause, to breathe, to fight another day. She'd been there at Ava's lowest, when the weight of it all had nearly drowned her, and she stood by her still, a quiet force helping her navigate the uncharted waters ahead. Malcolm, too, evolved beyond the role of father. He became her partner in this crusade, her fiercest defender. Justice had always been his creed, but now it was personal, a fire that blazed in his chest as he fought for his daughter's cause with a ferocity that left no room for doubt. Ava knew she'd have crumbled without him, without the steady hand that guided her through the darkest nights. Months later, she stood before a packed auditorium, the hum of the crowd washing over her like a tide. Students, parents, teachers, all eyes locked on her, waiting. Once, the thought of speaking up had paralyzed her, but not now. She stepped to the microphone, her voice clear and unwavering. "Change doesn't come easy," she began, her words cutting through the stillness. "It doesn't happen because one person decides to stand up. It happens when we refuse to sit back down, when we stop turning our heads, when we say enough and mean it." The room hung on her every syllable, and for the first time, Ava felt she belonged there, not as the trembling girl who'd once sat in fear, but as someone forged anew, stronger, bolder, louder. When the applause faded, she scanned the sea of faces staring back at her, wondering how many had stayed silent in their own lives, how many had ignored the cries they'd heard, and how many might now hesitate before doing it again. This wasn't just her story. It was a mirror held up to everyone, a stark lesson in what happens when fear and apathy let injustice fester. Silence wasn't a passive act. It was a deliberate choice, one that shielded the powerful and buried the weak. Grant's fall, Hastings' ruin, they were proof that abusing authority carried a price, that justice, though slow, could strike with unrelenting force. But it was the voices that rose, the ones that refused to be muted, that truly shifted the world. Ava had learned that lesson in her bones, and now she carried it like a torch. So what would you do, she wondered silently, if you saw wrong unfolding right before you? Would you step into the fray, or would you let your eyes slide away, content to let someone else bear the cost? The answer mattered, not just for her, but for every soul who'd ever been wronged, and everyone who might still be saved.